Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Evan Lepler. We are nosing just past the midway point of the 2025 UFA regular season. And I've got to say, Evan, it's gone to chalk. It's gone completely as expected. All the standings are in the order that we predicted heading into this season. No, I mean, it's complete chaos. Once again, we've got three undefeated teams after week 7 in Boston, Chicago, and Austin, the latter of whom had a really impressive SoCal road trip doubleheader. As I noted in the power rankings this week, the first time Austin has swept a road trip doubleheader in their franchise's existence. So hats off to the Soul, best start in franchise history. They look like the hottest team in the league right now. If not, we can make contentions for Chicago and Boston. But, I want to deplatform here because I want to get to your take on just the lay of the land. I feel like every single week we've got to take this kind of 30,000 foot picture of what is going on because these standings continue to get jumbled. The playoff races continue to tighten in the back half of this schedule. What are you seeing looking at the association heading into week 8?
Yeah, good to be with you, Adam. I did feel like last weekend was a little bit less chaotic and crazy and stunning than the previous few weekends. So, look, it's easy to say like it's all chaos. Last weekend, we got some one-sided affairs, and I think, we could see a lot of them coming. That's not to say we didn't have crazy comebacks like Austin at San Diego or Salt Lake at Oakland. I want to get into both those
I
games,
was
but
gonna say,
my,
it's not chaos. It's just a couple overtime games. Montreal winning by 9 goals one night, turning around, losing by 10 goals the other game.
that's
DC
fair.
having their most dominant win against New York maybe ever, even though that game was relatively close until the
Yeah.
second half surge.
New York's biggest loss since that game at DC late in the 2018 season. I mean, the Empire hadn't lost a game by more than 5 goals in 7 years, which is ridiculous. But my big picture takeaway is we got four first place teams right now. Boston in the East, Chicago in the Central, surprising Austin in the South, and now Salt Lake in the West after their win at Oakland. And with half a season to go, and for Chicago with three-quarters of a season to go, all four of those teams have really difficult stretches coming up. Like Boston goes to Canada this weekend. 5 of their final 7 games are on the road. Chicago, while on paper they are going to be favored in every game that they have left, they have 4 doubleheader weekends, and they're all tricky road trips. They're all one game at home, one game on the road, and I know there's some games at Detroit and Indy in there that, on paper should be easy Chicago wins, but like maybe Chicago has the easiest of the 4 first place schedules, but they still have 9 games in basically just over a month, which is not an easy thing for a pro ultimate team that's trying to find consistency and cohesiveness with all their depth and good players. You got the Austin Soul, who have to go to Atlanta and to Carolina, and they have the Flyers coming to town on the final weekend of the season in a game that could be really big. And Salt Lake still has games at home against Oakland, at home and away against Colorado, and a home interdivisional matchup against Minnesota. So just like every one of these teams has real challenges and also contenders in their division. I know you feel like Boston and Austin have pretty big leads. I think Austin is probably like the most likely team to just run away with their division right now just by the nature of their schedule. But
They
like
could.
as I said last week, I think Boston's going to come back to the pack. I think we'll find out this weekend whether that's going to happen, whether they can go to Canada and get it done in both games, or whether they go 1-1 or 0-2. And remember, Montreal hadn't lost at home yet this year, so the Royale will take on Boston 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. By the way, isn't that random? But it's fun, like a 1 o'clock Saturday game. Montreal's given us those through the years, and I like those Saturday matinees. And yeah, I mean, I think, but like the Salt Lake situation in the West, they are, in my opinion, the most precarious first place team of the bunch. And in a lot of ways, they shouldn't be in first place because you could argue they could be 3-3 right now, Adam, instead of 5-1, because they really could have lost that game to Seattle that they trailed in by 6, and they really should have lost to Oakland on Friday night. And that was, look, it was a bad look for the Spiders, if we're going to get into that game now, because the Spiders, I think we're up by 2 or 3 with like 4 minutes to go, and just did not manage the late game moments well down the stretch. And I know it's especially frustrating for Caleb Merriam in Oakland because they were practicing those types of situations earlier that week, and it
Yeah.
didn't translate from practice to the game. And like, the Spiders, in the span of 2 weeks, gave up leads against Colorado on the road and Salt Lake at home. And instead of being a clear number one, they're now, might have to go on the road and win 2 playoff games to get to championship weekend. So they are a really interesting story right now, because their luster has lost a little bit of its shine after giving up a couple of games that were very winnable these past 2 weeks.
I don't know how you did it, but you just disparaged both Salt Lake and Oakland, despite one of those teams winning the game last Friday. Did
I'm
it
that
really
good.
unimpress you from both ends, the 2 top teams in the West that way? Like, I kind of hear what you're saying. I do make sense of your logic with both teams, and I want to respond to both bits, but I find it interesting that you found that matchup so problematic for both sides of the sideline.
This glass is half empty right now, Adam.
I just did
That's
a
just
glass
how I
half
see
full, glass
things.
half empty for the rankings. So it's very fitting that you take one side to things. No, I don't disagree that the Shred have had some out from under games in which it is okay to, I think, have some skepticism about their current 5-1 record. However, I think that they've been, one of the more opportunistic teams. We talked about Philly kind of having that through the first month or so of the season. I feel like the Shred have really had that throughout their 5-game winning streak. They know when to kind of put their foot on the gas pedal that much harder. And as much as I agree with you, I think we should take a second to dissect about Oakland's collapse. I think on the other side of the ball, the Shred defense won that game too. I mean, Will Selfridge coming through with the block in the clutch. You could, at least I did watching it live, it felt like Salt Lake with their pressure was going to create a turnover in those final moments. I mean, I had no faith in the Spiders offense's ability to just possess the disc on the stretch, both because of Oakland's deficiencies and because this Shred defense right now is playing like a monkey with a loaded revolver. Like, they just want to create chaos. They want to break out in transition downfield. They want to make you feel it every single time you swing the disc to the middle of the field. Like, this has been a complete defensive transplant, and they're better from last year when they won 10 regular season games. I think that for as much as this young Shred team still has a lot to prove in 2025, I think what they've shown so far in their body of work has been extremely impressive. And then we can talk about the Spiders, who, have now lost 2 in a row after their blitzing 5-0 start, looking like the best offense in the league. They still look like a fantastic O-line, but I think their problem right now is that they don't know how to slow the game down. To the point of the end of that matchup last Friday against the Shred, the Spiders offense could not figure out a way to not just look for 1, 2, 3 chain looks and sort of ratchet it downfield. They had a real inability to sort of move the disc in the backfield, move it horizontally across the field without it kind of creating high stall situations or bailout
Yeah.
throws or just turnovers.
Their decision making was bad, their structure was poor, and they just didn't handle the end of game moments well. One thing I loved that Bryce Merrill and the Shred D line did in that final sequence, like Oakland's receiving with 27 seconds left and a 1-goal lead. Salt Lake did the sideline pull and force the trap, but they did not double team the disc. They had their best, 7 lockdown defenders out there, and trusted that creating that one-on-one pressure with every matchup and not giving a release valve, even though you're creating added pressure with the double team. Like, we've seen that a little bit in the past, but more often than not, when a team pulls out of bounds, they set up a double team. I thought that was a real interesting and, as it worked out, really great choice for Bryce Merrill in the shred because it may just have been a little bit different than what Oakland was expecting. There wasn't the release valve. They had to throw it into a contested window. And yeah, Reed Browning got the block, and everybody else on that Salt Lake D line deserves a ton of credit for the suffocating pressure in that moment with the game on the line because more often than not, historically, we've seen teams be able to complete a handful of passes in the game. With that said, like one of the storylines over the past few weeks is teams not handling sideline double team traps. We saw it again. Carolina almost gave it away down the stretch against Atlanta. We saw Atlanta struggle with it against Chicago. Like really top tier offenses in this league, people like to say, oh, there's no defense played in the UFA. You're just telling me you're not watching and not paying any attention and you don't know what
Right.
you're talking about if you say that. Because defenses are becoming more complex, more sophisticated, and the pressure of those moments can get things really tight for even the best throwers in our sport.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of diverge from defensive talk and talk about Chad Jorgensson for a second
Oh,
because his first half season on offense for the Shred has just been a thrill to watch. We talk about the complexities of defense. Jorgensson has been playing like a sledgehammer. I mean, the stat lines are absolutely Russell Westbrookian. Like it's numbers across the board, every category, including turnovers. But his ability and his athleticism puts so much pressure on opposing coverage. And you just saw that against the Spiders. Like the Spiders had a lead, and yet every single time that Shred O was receiving the disc, it's like, man, they're going to push it upfield. Man, they're going to keep that tempo high. They're going to look for Rusnagel and Kerr and Dunabile downfield, all of whom are starting to play exceptionally well this season. Again, like the Shred just have this manic, feverish pace to them. And it's all because Chad Jorgensson is playing like a dog unchained. Like he is just running people into the dirt. It's got to be one of the three least fun assignments is just to guard Chad Jorgensson for 4 quarters, figuring out who gets to be that sacrificial lamb to him just running wild. I mean, they really just give him the green light, and it's just go 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 all of the time. I do not think of a real kind of comparison, maybe like Leandro Marks, as far as just an ability to every single possession, every single drive, just be the centerpiece, just be driving action at all times. It's a thrill to watch.
it does seem like he never gets tired and he's always at full speed and he just plays with a verve that you're describing. And yeah, I'm with you. I mean, he's easily on my top 5 list for MVP. We're going to come out with a midseason all UFA squads, you, me, and Daniel, and I haven't seen your choices yet. But I do think it's interesting how like Chad Jorgensen. So, like, to spoil the article a little bit, and I'm not sure what's going to come out first, the podcast or the article, but I got Tanner Johnson Go as my defensive player of the year so far. And, like, he's been an O-line guy for Boston who switched to D this year and has excelled. Chad Jorgensen's kind of the opposite of that, right? He's been a D-line guy historically, played a little bit of O late last year, has been a guy that's crossed over in big moments, but we thought of him as a D-line playmaker. And he's brought that D line mentality to the O line. And even Bryce Merrill has been surprised. I think Bryce told me, and I may have said this on a broadcast, like he was willing to accept the lower completion rate from Chad, I think compared to his brothers McKay and Luke, who are probably a little bit more efficient, maybe a little less electric, but more efficient. And he's like, yeah, Chad could be 92, 93% completion rate, but he's going to get us some of those discs back on turnovers, so it's worth it. His completion rate is still really high, and it's higher than it's ever been, and he's still making plays. And yeah, I mean, he's probably my number 3 MVP right now, and certainly in the mix. And I think the MVP race is crazy close. So, like, yeah, with the tough games that they've got coming up and the spotlight opportunities that he's going to have, he is such a great player, such a great leader, and I mean, a really fun guy to watch because you kind of never know what he's going to do next. Like he could play in system, he could play out of system, he could, dump, swing, and handle, or he could just launch crazy layouts, out of bounds into the bench and, come up with a bloody nose and still keep playing. Like he just seems like that kind of guy.
It just feels like on certain points he teleports around the field where it's like, okay, he's initiating in the backfield, and then all of a sudden it's Kerr shooting to him, running away from everyone like he's been the receiver setting the stack. I mean, again, his ability to just rack up ground mileage against his defender, I feel like is a central part of this offense's identity, which is just pressure all the time, every angle. You're not thinking about this guy. Okay, Russ Noggle is releasing from the back and he's going to score. How fun is he this season, by the way? Another guy released from sort of the shackles of D-line promiscuity into an offensive stardom role, and he just feels like such a nice compliment to, again, this fiery energy that the Shred offense has going. Again, I like the whole team identity this year. They feel so bought in and kind of this youthful exuberance. And the last couple of years, the Shred have sort of fallen apart down the stretch because they had this sort of disciplined, almost overly severe, I feel like, adherence to the system. This year, to your just point a moment ago about Chad Jorgensson, there are moments of system. There are absolute structured good outcomes, but there's this wild side, man. And I feel like Russ Noggle, Selfridge, like Jorgenson's, like there's just a lot of players who can step up and make plays. Tony Munga, Kyle Weinberg, like again, this defense kind of goes deep in 2025.
Yeah, and they're young guys that were clearly talented, but raw and unpolished have made plays in big moments in big games. And yeah, like I'm still not totally sure what to think about the Shred. Like in some sense, you are what your record is. They're 5-1. They're in first place. I've been really impressed in stretches when I've watched them, but they also look totally lost throughout much of the first half against Seattle, and they're not far away from being 3-3. And 3-3 is very average right now in the league, and there are teams in the East that are 3-4 and 3-5 and 2-4 and scrapping for their playoff lives. And yeah, so I'm curious to see what the Shred are and like how. I don't have a satisfying answer for like, do I think Salt Lake is better than Oakland? They manage the end of the game better than Oakland. Do I lean their way in a future matchup? Probably, because they're at home and because I like their infrastructure and Bryce Merrill is my coach of the year so far. But Oakland is still a really scary team. And I think if you just lined up, Oakland starting O line versus Salt Lake starting O, and Oakland starting D versus Salt Lake starting D, you might put the check mark on Oakland's side of things, even though they couldn't finish the game. So that's why I feel unsatisfied and uncertain about how this race is going to continue to unfold.
Shred have never lost to Oakland, just as a little footnote there, though. Like this Salt Lake team has built an identity beating the Spiders since 2022 in a way. Like they've been good games. They've been close at times, really high octane, but it always kind of plays into exactly the kind of strategy that the Shred love and have adopted as their central sort of mantra, which is just fast break all the time, pressure, 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 run, run, run. We'll trust our legs and our depth to just outlast you for 4 quarters. Again, these sort of late game surges for the Shred, we kind of say like, ooh, there's some skepticism there. And yet at the same time, this is sort of by design. They're breaking down their opponents and able to just cash in on breaks at the end of games in the most vital moments. And I think it'll be interesting to see, if in the back half that continues to be the case for a Shred team that I think does have something to prove, again, given the amount of roster turnover that they had going into 2025. But we've got so
By the way,
here.
Can I just put this on your radar really quick, and then we'll move on? 2 weeks from now, Friday, June 27th. We've had a couple of these like greatest Friday nights in the history of the league. There are 6 games on that Friday night, but at 7 o'clock, Montreal at DC. At 8 o'clock, and these times are Eastern, Austin and Atlanta. 9 o'clock Eastern, Oakland at Salt Lake. 10 o'clock Eastern, Colorado at Seattle. How is that for a Friday night lineup? Games staggered every 4 hours and like really meaningful games. You know, Seattle's going to want to play spoiler. Every other game is going to have really important playoff implications. What a Friday night that's going to be.
I mean, it feels like every Friday night going into the playoffs at this point is going to have a pretty loaded slate of games. I did want to offer you the choice between where we venture next, whether we talk about the South Division, and I think most notably Austin and Carolina, or whether we try and disentangle the East. East is going to be a beast like it always is. You know, it used to be kind of because of the contender status of DC and New York, and now it's sort of skewed into the opposite, where it's like, any given week, it feels like a different team is the hottest team in that division. Right now, like you say, it's Boston sitting atop it at 5-0. But, you know, you made a point earlier in kind of a generalized observation about the teams at the top of each of the divisions. My hot take going into week 8 is I feel like the two hottest teams right now in the league are the two teams that I would be most scared of heading into the back half of the schedule are actually below 500. One of them being Carolina at 3-4 and one of them being 2-4 Toronto. Carolina sitting in the South Division, Toronto being in the East. So again, I'll kind of let you choose which division we start to pick apart, but
so I've got like a half-formed take that I have not run by you, but I'd like to flesh it out.
That's exactly
And
what the show is for half-baked ideas.
good. Here's the out of left field question, and please just go with me on this for a second. Indulge me. Did you watch Game 3 of the NBA Finals?
I
last
haven't
night?
yet. No, I'm sorry. I apologize
Okay,
as a hoop head.
but do you know what happened?
Vaguely. No,
Okay.
I've been immersed in Frisbee.
Okay. Well, I don't want to spoil it for you.
You
If
can't
you
spoil live sports, Evan. I'll die on this hill. I've tried to in YouTube comments.
So really exciting game last night. Pacers shockingly are up 2-1 in the NBA Finals. A Pacers team that nobody saw coming. So I'm thinking this morning, who could be the Pacers of the UFA in 2025? Like a team that clearly is talented, clearly in the mix, well coached, but like, you know, could actually maybe realistically, you know, have an 11-9 lead at halftime of the championship game. That like we're like, whoa, how did we get here? Because look, we're not a basketball podcast, but the Eastern Conference in the NBA had two 60-win teams that were two clear juggernaut favorites, and then a New York team that was also better than Indy during the regular season. Indy was a middling team through the first half of the year and then turned it on, and all of a sudden they're 2 games away from what would be the most improbable NBA title in a very long time, maybe ever. So I don't know if you have an answer, but I think the Austin Soul are the Indiana Pacers of the UFA. And I know that they're 6-0 and it's not a perfect analogy. But like if the Austin Soul with what they've got right now in a 3-game lead atop the East and like the opportunity to host the South Division final and get to championship weekend and be massively overlooked and be accused of being frauds. Like, do they have the pieces, the unknown, you know, the Aaron Neesmiths and the Andrew Nemharts and the Ben Matherins and the Obi
All right,
Toppins
now
up
you're
and
getting
down
way
their
in
roster?
there.
Could
Getting in
they
the nitty-gritty.
could they have a lead at halftime of the championship game? And here in week 8, we like never would have thought that was possible. Is there a chance that the Soul could be like the Pacers and be a shocking championship contender, even though they barely beat 1-5 LA on Friday night? What do you think?
I'm squinting and adjusting my glasses at the comparison. As much as I like the Soul, and I do agree that this Pacers title would be fantastic. Shout out Rick Carlisle, who would, I think, have 2 of the Infinity Stones on the most improbable championship gauntlet, you know, this year, and then the 2011 Mavs run. So one of the greatest coaches of all time. Just wanted to shout him out real quick. But This Seoul team is so impressive. So let's start with their positives. How about just their overall tenor as a team this year? As far as an identity, I think the Seoul are right at the top of the UFA rankings as far as that goes. They know they want to get out and run at you on defense. They create amazing pressure. They're one of the best teams at producing breaks and just giving you 4 quarters of business. As you were just mentioning earlier in the pod, as far as the importance of sideline double teams, Stephen Nagy and his staff have coached this Seoul defensive squad fantastically in their coverages. They did endure a good amount of roster turnover, and it has not mattered. One of my big things coming into 2025 wasn't necessarily the losses on O-line of Mark Evans and Jake Radak and Duncan Fitzgerald. It was them losing Matt Armour on defense and kind of the value that he added to both their coverage and specifically their counterattack paired alongside Jake Reinhardt. But in 2025, the Austin Seoul have been able to kind of shift Eric Broadbeck and Joey Wiley between offense and defense. And again, that system identity, that ability to sort of interchange between roles on the fly, that flexibility, it's lended all of the difference for the Seoul as they've built this undefeated 6-0 record in the first half of their schedule. And I think to your question of, could you see them up at halftime of the championship game this year? Yeah, I think after this road trip in LA and San Diego, they have shown that they can acquit themselves in challenging situations. And I think given, again, their ability to play to their strengths and mask a lot of their weaknesses and still come out on top is a big, big, big plus for them. I just... Where I struggle with the Seoul this season is that it feels so similar of a script for them to succeed as what they had in 2023, right? They were in a very similar spot. I think they kind of came into championship weekend sort of as a little bit of the consensus 4 seed, had made a fantastic white hot run through the South Division playoff bracket, beating Carolina, beating Atlanta. But they sort of ran into a brick wall with New York. They talked a really hot game about how they were confident they could challenge the Empire. They went up 2-1 or 2-0, and then
2-0.
Then the wheels just absolutely came off. The tow truck was called out. That caught on fire. It was a mess for a team that had rode this wave of confidence and playmaking and athleticism and depth and a strong team identity. And so having so much of the same characteristics despite some of the personnel being different, it just feels like I want to know what the actual ceiling is for Austin. If it's semifinals or if it is a championship game. If it is, getting past a semifinals opponent. I just don't know if that's in 2025. I still think this South Division is going to get brutal in the back half of the 2025 summer schedule.
Well, look, because they won at San Diego after a miserable start to that game, by the way, they are in a position where, as long as they don't lose, I mean, they're very likely going to host the South Division championship game. Yeah. Now, if they lose twice to the Flyers and lose to Atlanta, and the way the tiebreakers work out, there's still a possibility. The Hustle would need to run the table, basically, to prevent the Seoul from hosting. And that would mean Atlanta needs to win at Carolina, which is a place they've really struggled to win. And we can talk about that game and what happened there this past weekend. Another weather delay, Atlanta, Carolina. My goodness. So despite my comparison to a team that's 2 games away from a championship and stunning, I still am not buying this Austin team. I can't buy, yes, I respect LA, but Austin didn't play well against LA. And they didn't play well at the start against San Diego.
And they made won.
They made some crazy plays late in the Growlers game. I don't know how sustainable that's going to be against Atlanta and Carolina. So even though they're 6-0, even though they have a 3-game lead in the South, I would still feel stunned if they are the team representing the South at championship weekend. I'm not saying they can't do it, but I would be very surprised. Which is why I think
performances like we saw from the Flyers? Is it also because of the other
It's
team?
it's
Or is it
because of the ceiling of the hustle and the ceiling of the Flyers and the comparative ceiling of the soul. And look, I don't need to enlighten our listeners. They're really knowledgeable. They know that Austin has had a gift of a schedule with, a Radicals team on the second night of a back to back and a Colorado team that was reeling on the second night of a back to back. And they'll play Houston 4 times before it's all said and done. And if Houston played a schedule comparable to Atlanta or Carolina, they would not be hosting the South Division Championship game. But they are going to host the South Final, and they absolutely could win a home playoff game in 110-degree heat in July or August. And I like their team. I like what Coach Najee has done. The players that you mentioned, Wiley and Broadbeck, like two of the guys in the league that are two of the 10 most underrated guys that we don't discuss enough, that are just kind of relentlessly good in whatever role you put them in, like Jackson Potts' emergence on the O-line. Elliott Moore continues to flex back and forth to O&D.
Kyle Henke destroying the
Yeah,
Aviators every single time they match up every 3 or 4 years?
there's some. I was trying to think about this. Like, could I compare Kyle Henke to Tyrese Halliburton? And I settled on yes, I can,
Okay.
because
All right.
Halliburton's a little quirky. Not as hyped as the other stars on Team USA, and yet like big play, clutch play. How
All
many
right.
games
All
has
right.
Halliburton won
I'll
down
buy
the
it.
stretch? Kyle Henke, just like, this guy that could put a team on his back. So, yeah, the more and more I talk about it, I like this Pacers Soul comparison. And I still, if the Eastern Conference playoffs were happening again, I would pick the Celtics or the Cavaliers, and I might be wrong, but that's where, we are. That's what makes sports so great, is that this Austin team is in position to capitalize on everything they've built and everything they've worked for, and they're in a great spot. But am I a believer at this point? I'm not. And really it's because of how the Hustle have lost their 3 games in a row. Feel like all 3 have been kind of toss-ups. And, they've lost those games. They haven't played well. Brett Holzmeyer did not have a very good game at Carolina this past
No.
Saturday
No.
night. And yeah, like it is fair for us to ask questions about the Hustle and where they are now relative to where they were just a couple of weeks ago when they were 6-0 and the juggernaut of the league. Similarly, the Flyers, like you asked me before, do I think the Flyers deserve to be considered favorites in a game against Austin? At Carolina, when Austin's in the second day of a back to back, yeah, I think the Flyers deserve to be considered favorites. At in Texas, though, it depends on the climate, depends on the rosters. Like Carolina still hasn't had its best players all together this season. I'm curious if we're going to see Elijah Long or Seth Weaver. We're seeing Dylan Hawkins back in the mix. That helped out the Carolina offense. I thought it was. Didn't you write that in the power rankings that their Flyers top 4 of Laviolette, Fairfax, McDonald, and Smith? You said they were playing the best of any offensive quartet in the league. I hadn't thought about that, and I think it's a really interesting claim, and I'm not sure I agree, but I'm remembering that right? You wrote that?
Yep. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'll stand by it. I mean, they're humming right now. Laviolette is playing like an MVP. Let's not mince words about it. He's absolutely on fire every single time he touches the disc. I was talking with somebody else earlier this week. It's like him, Ryan Osgar, and Quinn Finer as far as the prototype kind of player you want in that continuation striker role, where they're just sprinting underneath, catching a disc, turning, reading upfield, and releasing all in one motion with a kind of consistency and precision that is just not really replicable on an individual level. Like that is where Alan Laviolette is just in cruising altitude right now. And then you add in the rest of the playmakers on this offense. Again, Jacob Fairfax just casually having another fantastic season. One of the
So
best
good.
two-way, probably one of the six best two-way players in the league still. Like his ability to get turnovers, he had one against Atlanta this last weekend. Atlanta was almost going to cash in a break. Here comes Fairfax flying in to challenge a goal. Look at Jakeem Polk to earn the disc back for the Flyers. Oh, they're consistently within the top 5 in hold percentage, and that's because of Jacob Fairfax, and this is the backbone of this offense's defensive coverage off of turns. Rutledge Smith and John McDonald are just playing fantastic ball right now. They look like they've completely imported the chemistry that they had in college, which is unsurprising, but I think the speed at which they're attacking defenses is such a fantastic place for this Flyers offense to start from. Again, where we saw them struggle coming into 2025 was mimicking the initiation that they had through Saul Yannick and Matt Johannes and Elijah Long. And without any of those kind of starting throwers this year, they struggled to get the disc out of the backfield. Now with Smith and McDonald and Laviolette and everyone else kind of having their footing underneath of them this season, they're just starting to click and fly, man. I mean, they're really getting into their looks like the Flyers that we're used to seeing. And if this defense can continue to kind of pick up play a little bit more in a string, not just sort of rely on individual playmaking out in space, but actually play as a unit, maybe get some more health and returning vets back. Yeah, I just wouldn't want to face Carolina in the second half of this 2025 schedule and going into the postseason. They're starting to wake up and they're starting to look like the Flyers team we always expect to push deep into the playoffs.
So let me ask you this. I mean, you just raved about Austin and raved about Carolina. Who would you predict to come out of the South Division, Adam? Because I'm guessing it's
Atlanta.
not either of those
Atlanta.
teams.
Because I agree with you. I think that their 3 losses have been amongst the most impressive in the league. You know, I think that they have some of the most logical defeats you could have, especially given what we've seen in 2025. They're not having to rally back into position. They're not giving up mega leads. They're able to always clinch close by the end of seemingly every game, including this last weekend where it looked like the Flyers might close out with a significant victory, but Atlanta ratcheted up the pressure late in the game. They created some turnovers. They pushed it to the final possession. And I just think Atlanta is still one of the most 5 impressive teams. That's why they remain in my power ranking top 5. And Carolina and Austin, still to kind of what we've been talking about on this episode, have foibles that theoretically, on paper, put them slightly beneath the hustle. But as we've seen throughout the season, that kind of means nothing. You know, we really got to see kind of to how you were splitting out who would you take between Carolina and Austin. We've got to see where the matchups take place. We've got to see what the active 20 looks like. We've got to know the health of these rosters because it comes down to individual matchups at the top end of the association this year. It really does. Like if you're missing that guy that's reliant in his role on something you do with your system, that's the difference between wins and losses.
Yeah, and we haven't mentioned San Diego in the South Division mix. Like they were so close to getting that win at home against Austin. It would have given them the tiebreaker. It would have put them in great position to surpass the Soul with Austin's incoming schedule. And now San Diego's in real danger of being the odd team out. Like, especially with their 2 games against Oakland that they've got. I mean, if they win the rest of their games and split those 2 against Oakland, they got 4 losses. I I spent some time this past weekend going through like trying to project. All right, so if I mean, there's a scenario where all 4 teams in that South finish 8-4, but for that to happen, Austin would have to lose a game to Houston or LA. So I think what's more likely is there's a 3-way tie for second place at 8-4 between Atlanta, Carolina, and San Diego. And if that happened, most likely San Diego would be the odd team out. This is projecting the Flyers would have to beat Atlanta a second time at home in Carolina, but it's such small margins in the league this year, and that fourth quarter where the Growlers had a 2-goal lead, and I mean, I still really couldn't like thinking back to watching that game. It was late Saturday night. I was tired. I watched the fourth quarter on my iPad in bed, but I just couldn't stop watching because it was like it, the playmaking down the stretch from the Austin Soul in the second day of a back to back was awesome, and they stole that game from San Diego, and the Growlers just couldn't quite measure up in those biggest moments. And for a team that's played really well and played admirably against Atlanta and won in double overtime at Carolina, unless they can beat the Spiders twice, which seems like a tall task, I think there's a good chance that they could be on the outside looking in. Now that the
Well, and
what
here's specifically
uh,
why. It's the defense. Like this Growlers team, when you just kind of look at the stats, you look at the players, you look at the tape, they're playing really well, but their defense can't get stops in moments that they need. Even against Carolina in that overtime win a couple weekends ago, it was just a shootout down the stretch. It was just the Growlers, being a little bit more explosive than a Flyers offense that hadn't quite fully formed yet, hadn't reached their final form. And I think now that we're reaching the midseason and all the other offenses have kind of been able to catch up with where the Growlers have been at since seemingly their second game, it's really exposed a San Diego defense that is good at capitalizing in transition to get break scores, but something about their coverages, they just,
yeah
they can't produce turnovers on 50-50 balls. Like Austin was just kind of playing 500 at certain points. There was a hanky to hanky hammer that should not have connected, and yet San Diego just couldn't stop the onslaught. And yeah, it's kind of been emblematic. And look, in their 3 losses, the Growlers have committed 16 turnovers this past weekend, 12 when they lost at Atlanta on May 24th, and then 16 when they lost at the buzzer on May 9th at home against the Hustle. So it's not exactly like the Growlers are, getting routed here or having an entire quarter where they fall apart. But to your point,
yeah
I think Oakland's going to be a really tough matchup for them, especially with that Spiders offense. And yeah, I think it's going to be a big task for them to claw out at least one win in those 2 upcoming matchups. And if they drop both, that's 5 losses.
Yeah, well, so
7-5.
here's the key thing, Adam, and I should have mentioned this before. Like the most important game for San Diego's playoff hopes, like yeah, obviously their games are important, but it really is that last Atlanta Carolina game or Carolina getting a fifth loss against Austin because San Diego in a head-to-head tiebreaker with Carolina wins it obviously because they won the only head-to-head meeting. But because of their 2 losses to Atlanta and their 1 loss to Austin, any 3-way or 4-way tiebreaker doesn't go the Growlers' way. So if it's a head-to-head tiebreaker, like San Diego needs Carolina to lose once more to make the playoffs. Like kind of independent of what the Growlers do, unless San Diego runs the table, which I would be surprised, or like gets absolutely blitzed and falls out of it on their own. I'd be surprised. It feels like that, whether Carolina gets a fifth loss, because I don't see Atlanta getting a fifth loss, but they certainly could. And if all those teams end up with 5 losses, that's also bad news for San Diego because they'd be on the outside looking in, unless, so there's a lot of moving pieces, obviously. But as I do my kind of projections and look forward, I feel like, man, San Diego, could be the best team that doesn't make the playoffs this year when it's all said and done.
A very inillustrious banner to be hanging in your stadium, I feel like. That's not the one you
Yeah.
want to be unfurling.
Which East Division team do you think will want to hang that banner at the end of the season?
Oh, man. What a question. I mean, again, each week, this race for third place and just the general, tapestry of the East Division complicates itself, furthers rivalries. Like I said somewhere at the beginning of this episode, Toronto right now, with how they're playing and how much potential they still have in front of them, just kind of getting their legs underneath of them, is one of the scariest teams, I think, in the entire association. I think the true dark horse in the format this year. Their athleticism is imposing. They're a beast in one-on-one matchups. I mean, the European imports are just playing out of their minds this year. Tom Blasman looks like one of the top 5 throwers in the league. They didn't even have Karklands really doing much this last weekend, and they still routed a Royale team that has been surging. They were tired on
Yeah.
the second game of a back-to-back, but Toronto exposed them for it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just kind of the tipping point. They're 2-4. They're at the bottom of the standings still. And
Yeah,
yet,
2-4 is not good.
no, it's not. And yet it feels like everything's within striking distance. Like you say, it'll be interesting to see if Boston pulls back to the pack. Toronto has a terrific opportunity to take advantage of a Glory team that will be traveling light and on the second game of a back-to-back this coming weekend. So can the Rush capitalize again on a schedule that set them up favorably at home? We'll see. I think that's going to be a big storyline for the Rush this season.
Yeah.
You
The
know,
Glory have a lot of good players this weekend, but they are still fulfilling my stereotype of how Boston doesn't travel well. Because,
right.
Tanner Johnson playing in London this weekend instead of in Montreal and Toronto. And that's a huge loss for them with his value to the D line. Like, yes, they still have a really talented group, but yeah, it's a tough ask for Boston to go win these 2 games, and maybe they do it, but maybe they lose it. The thing I find interesting right now about the East, Adam, if we're trying to pick 3 teams that we think are most going to be worthy at the end, you have 3 teams in the East right now that have not been blown out, and you have 3 teams in the East that have been blown out at least once. And the 3 teams that haven't been blown out, Boston, DC, and Toronto, all of the Toronto losses have been super close games. And whether those close losses mean that, those missed opportunities are going to cost them, or it says that, like, their net rating, if you can think about it like that, is really at a higher level, and they will continue to rise as they get better. Their depth has really been impressive to me,
Yeah.
like better than I expected. And they're going to need it because they have a bunch of U24 Team Canada guys. They're going to miss some time. Their World Games guys, Mark Lloyd and Marty Galat, are going to miss some time. But I mean, the way they won this past weekend by the margin they did without some of the guys that we would have thought as their key guys sends a message like, yeah, they need to be taken seriously because they've shown they can win shorthanded. And the question is, can they do it on the road? Because, like, a couple weeks from now, they go to New York and Boston back to back.
Yeah.
They still have to play at Montreal twice, where the Royale haven't lost this year so far. So, like, those are 4 difficult road games, and it's going to be really interesting. Like, I'm kind of rooting for the Rush. Like, I want this reboot to go well. I want other teams to be inspired, be like, hey, look what Toronto did. They, brought in 4 or 5 international players, reinvigorated their local community. Like, I want this to work for Toronto, so I'm rooting for them. Am I confident that they're going to be one of the last teams standing in the East? I'm not, because I think that's a really tough ask to go get wins at New York, at Boston, and at Montreal twice. And they've already got 4 losses, and those are 4 more possible losses. So even if they go 2-2 in those games, which is a hard task, they still need to, win everything else to get to 6-6, and that might not be good enough.
Yeah, but 3 other teams in their division have 3 or more losses. So it's not exactly like they're trailing the pack by that much. And you just look at how they're playmaking and the confidence that they're playing with right now from 0-4, from 1-4 in the standings. If they start to really build on this momentum, as you've been reporting on in the tosses throughout the last few weeks, no one really wants to see this team's final form. They all kind of see the larger shadow that I think the Rush can cast at certain moments, and nobody wants a piece of it. Like, Mark Lloyd is still him. He's still able to make these plays seemingly at command at the biggest moments when his team needs it. And he's surrounded by, I think, the best cast that Toronto has had since they made a championship game appearance in 2017. I mean, I don't think that's that controversial to state. This is the most talented Rush team in 7-8 seasons, and they've barely started playing like it. And again, the pack is right in front of them. I think I'm most curious about seeing what happens with DC, because they've got 3 losses, but to your point, none of them have been bad. They've got a couple of impressive wins now. I think that both sides of the disc are playing more up to the Breeze standard that we're familiar with relative to where they started the season. I thought the defense, especially at the start of the season, did not acquit itself well. Even with a young and kind of fill-in roster this past weekend against the Empire, they really broke things open in the second half against a pretty good New York offense that was able to be consistent through the first three quarters. So I think DC is really performing well. I just wonder, can they get back to where they were at last year when they entered championship weekend as the championship favorite? And, given the circumstances of that semifinals loss, it's sort of been this tumultuous fallout from the number one team in the entire league. And I think we forget about that given the amount of chaos and parity throughout the rest of the league. But this Breeze team is still a blue blood, and they still show it at times. That Kobe kid, the rookie that they just debuted on offense, that's exactly the kind of player that they need alongside Cole Jurek, who is not so quietly leading the league in receiving right now. Like, he's just been a monster for them in lieu of them losing a couple of players in Boxley not being able to start recently and Johnny Maltz not playing for them in 2025. Like, this Breeze team, they've been tasked with, I think, quietly having to figure out a lot of different positional adjustments from last season, and they're starting to click. They're starting to really, really put some things together.
I got another cross sport comparison for you.
Oh no. Where are we getting into? As long as it's not pickleball.
To your delight, this is going to be like a 25-year-old reference, maybe 20 years old. So, the young kids out there will certainly appreciate it. The DC Breeze are more and more like the early mid-2000s Peyton Manning Indianapolis Colts. They are really, really good in controlled conditions. They got a lot of weapons. They can light it up. They're going to have a good record. And then late in the year, it might get windy, might get rainy, and they just don't look like the same team when they can't play their style of play. And look, that Colts team, 2006, this is so painful for me to say because the Patriots should have won that AFC Championship game. They were up 21-3 at halftime.
No, if I had a spray bottle,
but the Colts won the championship and they had Rex Grossman waiting for them, and the circumstances aligned. So DC is absolutely capable of winning a championship. And I've seen them with my own eyes play two really awesome games this year at Carolina and this past weekend against New York. Will all the circumstances align perfectly for them to get the matchups they need in the conditions that they're most conducive for them to be good? That is my question for the DC Breeze right now. And I think it's a fair question.
I think it can be a little bit simpler than that, though. I think if they get a little bit healthier, too. They've had a casted Miles Grovic who still looks a little bit like of a Defensive Player of the Year finalist. I mean, that dude is just able to make plays on command. He is so...
you mean that time he fouled Jack Williams?
Oh, do we want to get into that call? That was one of the most abhorrent ghost calls I think I've seen in the past couple of seasons. Deprived an absolute primetime highlight. I thought Charlie Eisenhood called it great on air in the moment. But yeah, Grovic has just been so impressive. AJ Merriman is still playing well. Again, they've had to inject a lot of not super experienced players into that defensive rotation, and they're all playing pretty well. Micah Wagner, I thought, played really well this past weekend, both in coverage and just in space.
What about Aiden Downey's debut?
Oh man, thank you for bringing him up. I feel like we didn't bring him up last week either. That's a kind of player who can really elevate your ceiling. And you saw it last week, right? Like, I think it was his first touch was that IO flick leading out into space from 60 yards out.
He's like a Dwight Freeney on the defensive line for the 2004
man, you're going to keep
Colts.
extending it. Man.
He can just change a game at any moment.
He can. He's a game changer, to your point. He's an absolute X factor. And I think his coolness, his collectedness on the field, the composure that he shows alongside his playmaking fits in so well with this Breeze system. And I think you're going to just see him tap in more and more to, elevating this Breeze back to a potential championship contender if he continues to get, high rep, lots of playing time. And I think, we saw it last Friday, a little bit of spot roles on offense. Like if they need someone, an additional playmaker on offense, I think having the ability to call up a Callahan player from your D line is exactly what DC needs in lieu of, not having Boxley available every week, not having Malks this season. Rowan, I think, to his credit, having an absolute throwback game with his 8 assist performance, but not always being able to be the Rowan that I think we associate with his MVP status. He is in the twilight of his career. So I think Downey can be a real difference maker for this DC team as they look to get a home field playoff game in the East Division.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really excited to see DC play Boston a couple more times in the regular season.
Yeah.
That's
Two more
certainly a
games.
potential
Two
East
more.
final. Yeah, they play Sunday, July 6th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Boston, and then 6 days later, Saturday night, July 12th in DC. And in the game of the week this weekend, DC at New York again. And all of a sudden, it feels like the rivalry has totally flipped back in DC's favor. They've won the last 3 meetings. And it feels like this Saturday is like either the last stand for New York or quite possibly the end for New York. Which do you think is more likely on Saturday night for the New York Empire, a team that we have just penciled in to the playoffs each of the last 7 years?
Well, and I think it's exactly that, Evan. The irony and yet absolute fitting nature that their dynastic dominance over the division for several years, sort of the exact force working against them, where every team now is just dogpiling on at the opportunity to drive another coffin nail into this Empire team. New York is still playing relatively good ultimate. They're still one of the top, 5-8 offenses in the league. They still have playmakers on both sides of the disc. It's kind of similar to San Diego, where in big moments against tough opposition, they can't seem to come up with the bigger play. They're losing a lot of 50-50 discs, and that's the exact opposite of where we've seen this New York team succeed throughout multiple championship runs. And, Ben Yacht is playing out of his mind this year, frankly. I think it's one of his 4 or 5 best seasons, if not top 3. Like, he is just so efficient and continues to find a way to be one of the top producers in the entire associations late in his career.
I picked him as my top receiver through the first half of the season. I think he's been that good.
I mean, it's not an incorrect pick. I picked Toba, but yeah, I mean, you could absolutely pick Yacht. I mean, he continues to make the Yacht Club happen. I'm just so impressed with how he refines his game year in, year out. But yeah, it's alarm bells for New York. They've got 5 losses. They've got more losses than anyone else in the division. That matters, but they're still right in the thick of it. They can correct it. It's just I've lost confidence in their ability to, which is something we haven't been able to say about this franchise since 2018, that we've lost confidence in their ability to close out an important game. Like, they can do it. They have the ability to. I just don't see it happening right now in the East.
So this glass is no longer half full, but it is it's about a third full. It's not 2/3 empty.
Can we extend the metaphor to you're absolutely drinking out of the glass at the same time too?
Well, the point I want to make is this. Yes, New York has 5 losses. Yes, I think we should think of them as being in last place in the East. They've also played 7 of their 8 games on the road. That's literally an unprecedented stretch in the UFA. We've never seen that before. And it's a little bit of a stretch, but go with me. Remember that exhibition game they played at Philly? Technically, it's 8 of 9 games on the road. They played 1 game at home on a miserable, rainy Friday night against Montreal that they narrowly won. Things are not going well. Injuries have absolutely crushed them. It was really sad to see Oliver Chartok go down. He's doubtful. it's like every single Wednesday night practice, it feels like the Empire have lost somebody. Like, Drew Schnottigl was a guy that I expected to be an important player on their D line. Early practice, he like breaks his finger, and then right before the Boston game, Jack and Antoine both get hurt at a Wednesday practice, and then last week, Calvin Brown, the anchor of their deep game, goes down with like something that they didn't think was an issue when it happened, and then like a day later, he's like, "Yeah, I have a concussion." So it has been, Sam Jonas,
Yeah.
their top defender, tweaked a groin muscle 35 minutes before the game at Toronto. And then he was like, it has been a absolute avalanche of bad luck for New York, adding in all the road games they've played. They got 4 games at home. And, before last year, when they lost to Boston and DC at home, they hadn't lost at home in over a half a decade. So I'd like to think that the championship DNA of the veterans on this team is going to be able to will them to some wins down the stretch. But I just recorded the Friday night 6-pack to air on the Friday night games at halftime. And I talked about, like, on one hand, that could happen. They could find their mojo and make the playoffs at 7-5 or 6-6 and be a really dangerous team. On the other hand, the wheels could totally fall off and burn, and it could be ugly.
I
And
I
I
don't
don't know.
know. I don't know how their defense picks back up after what it's gone through, and again, what you've been talking about with their decimation of injuries to their starting lineup. I mean, look at this performance list in the last few games for the Empire defense against DC this past weekend. 2 breaks, 5 blocks. Against Toronto in the loss, 3 breaks, 8 blocks. Against Philadelphia, 1 goal win, 3 breaks, 9 blocks. Against Montreal, 1 goal loss, 4 breaks, 6 blocks. I mean, this is an Empire defense that used to absolutely pour it on against seemingly any team the moment they found an advantage point and could counterattack against you. And now they can barely get to 4 to 5 break scores against any given opponent. I mean, I just don't know how they redevelop that defensive identity and intensity, and again, kind of coverage mapping when they haven't had a healthy lineup week to week. I mean, I agree with you. There's DNA there somewhere, but the stats are just they're kind of the bottom's falling out a bit.
So it sounds like you think that they're not going to make the playoffs in the East, and that maybe they lose to DC and fall to 3-6 this weekend. Is that
Yeah.
what you are leaning toward?
I think DC defeats them this weekend. I'm interested to see if they can cobble together 3 wins in their last 3 games to maybe keep themselves in the playoff picture. But just again, to your point, it's sort of a different lineup and a different set of expectations for New York every single week. And that's just the exact wrong formula for how to compete in the 2025 gauntlet. Like, you need consistency in your roster week to week. I think that's one of the lessons we've learned as far as the teams that have been successful, has been being able to keep your rotations tight and intact. And for as talented as New York is, even when you look at them on paper going into this week 8 matchup, there's not enough reps together. There's still so many new pieces that they were looking to integrate, and it just felt like they've never had a chance to really establish any consistency.
Yeah, no, everything you say sounds very plausible. I wanted to ask you one other question about another East Division team. Do you still have any faith in the Philadelphia Phoenix, or after their 2 lopsided losses this past weekend, do
Ugh.
you see them as something of an afterthought in the East Division playoff race? Can they stay in contention for that 3rd playoff spot in the East?
It's just always the same with this team, right? It's hot birds to cold birds, 3-0 to 3-4. It's kind of remarkable. I still like the outline, the architecture that this team has adhered to since week 1. I think that the game plan that their coaching staff developed going into 2025 is as good as any teams throughout the league. I just think that there's clearly sort of a limit to what their talent has on the roster. And with the rest of the teams kind of catching up to speed after the Philly hot start, it's exposing them a bit.
Yeah.
Montreal was able to run roughshod over them. Like
Ooh,
Boston looked like they were practicing lineups by the second half against the Phoenix. Like
they
it's
were.
just there's a lot of youth on the Philly roster. There's a lot of, I think, exciting development that's happening, but they're running into the very real fact that they play in the hardest division in the entire association, and it's midseason, and everyone's fighting for their playoff lives, and they're just kind of starting to figure out that they're going to be somewhere at the lower end of these standings.
So they're at Pittsburgh on Saturday.
I think
And
that's a
while
great
this,
matchup for them.
yeah, I mean, it's a rivalry game, but man, Pittsburgh's fallen behind like 8-1 or 11-3 in the first half of almost every game they've
Yeah.
played in
Yeah.
their 4-game losing streak. So yeah, I think Philly could win this one to get to 4-4, and then they have their next two at home after that, right? Like they got Montreal at home and Boston at home, the teams that they just got crushed by on the road. Can they turn it around and get to 6-4 or 5-5? If they can, then they're at New York. Who knows what kind of mentality New York's going to have by July 13th? And then they got DC at home, a team that they've already beat that they're confident against. Like there is a roadmap there for this Philly team. But
I
you are absolutely right. They are the cold birds right now. And they have let some small bits of adversity really affect them. Like, I think back to the end of the first quarter against Carolina a couple of weeks ago, and they had a bad turnover, and Carolina scores at the buzzer and takes the lead. And like, there were 3 quarters in the game left, but it felt like Philly never really recovered. And the week before that, the game against New York, they were right there. If the Scott Heyman block is not called a foul, maybe they win that game. But it was, and they were so close, and they lost. So yeah, I'm with you in saying that like they're young, they're developing. It was an awesome start to the season. I think historically, over the past half decade, they've been the cold birds morphing into the hot birds too late. Now they started hot, but they're getting cold, and the way they lost those 2 games this weekend was kind of the worst of the past several years of Philly, when like they just couldn't really put up much resistance to the other team's offense at all. Like very few turnovers forced, very few break chances, and you know when your O line is going back on the field over and over again, that's generally not a good sign.
Well,
Like,
and look, they just don't match up well with Montreal this season on offense to Royale defense. This Royale defense has been playing as hot as anyone over the last few weeks, and specifically, they have some fantastic handler defenders. Iwan Cohoner, Thomas Landry, Charles Guay, who's been playing out of his mind in his 4th season with the Royale. Local
yeah,
product, has been homegrown. He's been making layout plays every single week, it feels like, for the Royale, especially at home. They know how to address the Phoenix offense at the point of attack, which is where Philly really found their success during their 3-game winning streak to begin the season. And now that they're playing some defenses with good handler defense, it's just not going well in Philadelphia.
yeah. I mean, part of me is sad because like I really enjoyed their kind of super surprise start
They're
to the
still
season.
fun.
Oh, it is still fun.
Paul Owens is one of the 7 best defenders. I have him as like a finalist for Defensive Player of the Year still, you know?
And like Friday, July 11th, if they're able to take care of business against Pittsburgh and then return the favor against the Royale, I know it's not a great matchup, but they're at home. Maybe they can dig deep for that one.
Yeah,
They could
yeah,
be 5-4
yeah.
in third place with Boston coming to town on July 11th. That's going to be a great Friday night too. I'm going to be out in Salt Lake City for the Summit and the Shred that night. But earlier in the evening on the East Coast, you got Boston, Philly, and that could be like a real statement opportunity for the Phoenix. But yeah, I mean, you said they struggle to match up with Montreal. On the best day, how do they match up with Boston if Boston has their full squad? That's a tough ask as well for Philly and their youth and just all the size and speed that Boston's got. Um, Adam, I got about 5 more minutes before I got to head to the airport and come to your city and get ready for Friday Night Frisbee. I
Mm-hmm.
would love to chat briefly about that Friday night matchup that we've got,
We
Madison
gotta.
and Minnesota, because they've had a lot of great games through the years. Like, I think before last year, before we kind of looked at Minnesota and thought like, yeah, they're a championship contender for sure. Like even independent of that, Minnesota Madison is an underratedly great rivalry, especially at Bree Stevens Field. Like what Ben Feldman has done for the wind chill in the form of everything that Tim DeBile created in Madison. And like, look, they talk a lot. They're friendly. Like, there's no doubt that Tim is something of a mentor to Feldman, and the way they've built that Minnesota team into a championship contender to win a title. And like we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Chicago going forward, but what we've seen from Minnesota the past couple of weeks, I'm this is so disrespectful to the Union, but like I'm still leaning the way of that first game was an outlier, crazy wind, whatever. Minnesota played poorly. I think Minnesota is going to be right there with Chicago at the end, and this is another real statement opportunity for them in a hostile environment at Breeze. And I'm looking forward to coming to the capital city of Ultimate and getting some cheese curds and being at the site of Championship Weekend 2025. What for you is the roadmap for Madison, a team that you've watched as much as anybody in this Friday night showcase?
I love that you underrated Minnesota coming into this year, and now you've rounded into saying they're going to challenge Chicago all the way to the end. It was always going to be head to head. I always think that Winchell functioned better as a slight underdog, and I think they needed to take that big home opener loss in order to really like fit into where they're pursuing their second straight title. But as far as Madison
Hey!
goes,
Before I let you answer the question I asked, can I break a small piece of news? It's not.
yeah.
It's more of a rumor than news, but I can report that the 2025 Ultiworld College Player of the Year, former Seattle Cascades teenage phenom Declan Miller, is considering joining the wind chill for the stretch run of the season. It's
Woo!
nothing is set yet, nothing is signed, but Miller was at wind chill practice earlier this week. Thomas Shope from that Carlton team as well was there. He's making his 2025 debut tomorrow. So we saw what Declan Miller did in very brief UFA action when he was 18 years old. I think before he started college, maybe he played a little bit his freshman year as well out in Seattle. And that could be an interesting splash in the Central Division pond if
Yeah.
that comes to
Yeah.
fruition.
All right, but you got to let me
Sorry. Yeah,
answer
go
the
ahead. I'm
Madison
sorry.
question. You just broke news on top of that. Plus,
Sorry.
if you want to talk about a cool rookie defender phenom for the Minnesota Wind Chill, how about Kyle Sulflo in his pro debut last weekend against the Thunderbirds? That kid, I think, is going to be something special. They've already
Mm-hmm.
got loaded defenders everywhere. But for the home team, the Radicals, this offense, they've got to find a way to play all four quarters. That's what it comes down to. The defense is going to keep them in every game. They complicate anything for any opposing offense. That's what they did. They did against Chicago last weekend. It's what they do against most offenses. But the Radicals O-line has to not fall apart for 3 to 4 point stretches at a time. And it's something that's beleaguered this team for several seasons. Their offense can look fantastic, kind of plays this nice little Plinko fast pace, move between all parts attack, and can really, I think, make a lot out of not necessarily household names, but there are just stretches where they'll flub in transition, they'll kick a disc in the backfield, they'll botch a red zone possession in a crucial moment, and then what is a back and forth game suddenly balloons into a contender taking a 3 to 4 goal lead, and that's it for Madison. And I think, again, we've seen that over the past couple of seasons where they punch up, they always make a battle against Minnesota and Chicago, but wind chill have held serve in Breeze Stevens the past couple of seasons against the Radicals. The wind chill offense always seems to save its best performances for the Radicals. They have an ability to just elevate Josh Klain, Will Brandt. They're so good against the pressures that the Radicals like to play. I think it's a real tough task for the Radicals going into tomorrow night. I think that they're going to have to bring their absolute A game. I think Minnesota is as inspired a team right now as any team in the league. I think that they're playing it very close to their chest. But I think that they've been taking a lot of the talk of last year's championship being an asterisk, them losing to Chicago out of the gate. I think their sort of imposter syndrome has been a motivating force in they're going to start really crushing teams as they build into their true chemistry, which again, they're continuing to add talent week to week. They're continuing to add absolute star talent. This Minnesota team isn't anywhere near their final form, and I think that they're going to be looking for a big W at Breeze.
Yeah, Madison leads the all-time series 19-15, but Winchell have won 11 of the last 12, including 5 of the last 6 at Breeze Stevens Field. So they absolutely, believe that they can win there, know that they can win there. I talked to both head coaches in the last 24 hours, Jacob Spiro for Madison and Ben Feldman for Minnesota. And, both coaches had kind of similar messages where I think, both teams are really confident in their D-lines and not as confident in their O-lines. And, the interesting thing about Frisbee, like compared to tennis, like in tennis, you serve one game and receive the next, regardless of whether you win the game, whether you hold. In ultimate, if you get broken, you got to serve again. And if you get broken again, you got to serve again. And you can't just get your D-line on the field. So there is a roadmap for the Radicals to get in the wind chill's offensive line's heads early in this game. Now, I think Minnesota is equipped to handle what Madison's going to throw at them, but that is the roadmap, and it is a reasonable, it could reasonably happen. Do I think Madison's the favorite? No, I think Minnesota deserves to be considered the favorite, but I do think it's going to be a close game, and I think it's going to come down to whether Madison's O-line can hold, because. The interesting thing talking to Spiro, though, he said that in Chicago last week, he felt like their D-line didn't create the pressure that they normally do. He's like, our offense did enough. If our defense did what they normally had done, we would have won that game. So that was an interesting thing for him to say. And
they didn't create as much pressure because they weren't playing against Indy and Pittsburgh suddenly. They have to adjust to the matchup a bit. I think that's been some of the frustration with the Radical system is that it is a little bit monolithic in how it approaches a given opposition. And against Chicago, you can't really do the same sort of sit back, trap, wait for an offside block against the throwers that the Union have. And I think you saw some of the cross-field angled looks that the Union were able to get for relatively easy scores from mid-range. And that's exactly where the Radicals have, I think a weakness in their system. And it's just, again, it works against an offense like Indy or the Thunderbirds, but against the Union and maybe Minnesota too, who have very skilled throwers, it can have some troubles.
I do think that this is an absolutely massive game for Madison.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to continue to have the same level of, belief and fervor and buy-in going down the stretch if you lose soundly to, the second place team in your division at home after you struggled down the stretch the previous week against the first place team in your division. What are you developing for? You're developing to compete with Minnesota and Chicago if you're Madison. So, similar to what I said about Minnesota before the Atlanta game, when I was like, Minnesota could lose this game, but they can't get blown out. I said if they lose 21-19, they're fine. If they lose 21-12, that's a really bad sign. Of course, they ended up winning the game. I feel the same way about Madison heading into this home game against Minnesota. If they lose 17-15, okay, respectable. But if it's 20-10 or something really lopsided, and the Radicals usually don't get blown out like that, although they lost by 9 in the Central Division Final at Minnesota last year. Yeah, it's a really important game for the 2025 Radicals to show what they can be against a good team.
I mean, Madison has won now 8 in a row at Breeze Stevens, but it would be a weird set of parentheses if Minnesota is the team that bookends, those experiences for the Radicals in their home
Yeah.
venue. And again, it would
Minnesota hasn't lost a road game since that disaster at Colorado 2023. So they've won 9 or 10 road games in a row, something like that.
Yeah. And I just think, again, one of the things that the Radicals don't have is like a Justin Burnett. And in this primetime matchup, I think he can really be a tilting piece for a Minnesota team that already has several in this matchup. But it's always a fantastic border battle. Looking forward to seeing you later tonight. I know that there's going to be a wash of other excitement throughout the league going into Week 8. Again, another fantastic Friday night lineup of games. Centerpieced by the Minnesota at Madison Friday night feature featuring Evan and the rest of our fantastic broadcast crew.
I got one more Indianapolis professional sports non-Frisbee. No, I'm just kidding. I dropped the Pacers and the Colts. I'll leave it there. But I could.
A lot of Hoosier State representation. I know Cam
the
Brock
Indiana
will be
State
thrilled.
Sycamores from 1979. Maybe I'll save that for next week.
Yeah, maybe save it for the book. That'll probably do it for this episode of Swing Pass, but we look forward to watching Week 8 alongside you on Watch UFA TV as well as the UFA YouTube channel. Again, you should check out the Watch UFA website as well to follow along with all of the coverage, all of the fantastic writing that's happening in the league right now, and we will talk to you soon, hopefully, with some really exciting news from another great weekend of matchups. You're also going to want to tune in, I shouldn't forget, the Game of the Week matchup, a rematch between DC and New York. That'll be on Watch UFA TV on Saturday night. Full lineup of games available. Again, if you go to watchufa.com, we will bid you adieu for now. But remember, Frisbee forever.